an understanding that we can apply to our daily lives and reflect Christ to the others around us. We love you, Lord. We ask that you bless all things and that you may bless us in all that we do. This is our prayer in Jesus' most holy name. Well, good morning. Last week I started talking about John chapter 9, the Gospel of John chapter 9, and got through about verse 34. There's about 6% discuss. Before I briefly review the we talked about, I know you heard this last week, so please bear with it. It's relevant in terms of how I introduce the next. Last week, John chapter 9, Jesus and his disciples were in Jerusalem for the Feast of the Tabernacles. Feast of the Tabernacles is a pretty important event for Jewish people, and there were Jews from all over the realm in Jerusalem at that time. They would have places like Samaria, Judea, Galilee, and Jerusalem would have been packed with people at this particular time. Well, while this is going on this is on a Sabbath day, keep in mind, the sixth day of the week, the day the Jews rest and they're not supposed to do any type of work or any other activities other than worship the Lord. On the Sabbath day, Jesus and his disciples are walking down a road, and they see a blind man off on the side of the road, and this man is begging, he's begging for charity, begging for alms. And as they begin to approach him, the disciples asked Jesus a question, and they said, Jesus, who is it that sinned? Was it this man or his parents that caused him to be born blind? And Jesus said, neither one. Neither he nor his parents sinned. He said, but this thing occurred so that the glory of God may be displayed in his life. And then Jesus goes on to say, while it is light, I must do the work of the Father who sent me, because the night is coming soon when no one can work. And then Jesus made what I consider to be one of the most significant statements in the whole Bible, is that Jesus says, while I'm in the world, I am the light of the world. And what I'm focusing on is Jesus saying, I am the light of the world. So at this point, Jesus approaches the blind man who's still sitting there on the side of the road, kneels down, and he spits into the dirt. I don't know, it seemed kind of disgusting that he did that, but that's what he did. He spit into the dirt, and he makes some mud out of the saliva, and he takes that mud and he wipes it on the blind man's eyes, and he tells the man, go to the pool of Siloam and wash your eyes. Go now, go wash your eyes. So the guy gets up, still blind, but he finds his way to the pool of Siloam, and he washes the mud off his eyes. And the Bible says as he washes that mud off, he can see. His sight is miraculously restored. Or he never actually had sight because he was born blind, but he's given his sight in a miraculous way, and he's overjoyed. He's rejoicing. He can see colors, he can see people, he can see houses, trees, the sky. Never experienced that before, but he sees these things. So the blind man goes back home to his own neighborhood. Keep in mind, he hasn't ever seen Jesus. He heard his voice, but he hasn't seen him yet because he was blind when Jesus was showing him. Goes back to his neighborhood, and some of the people there that knew him were rejoicing. They were happy. They were overjoyed. They were celebrating with this man who received his sight. But some of the other people there were skeptical and said, oh, that can't happen. Nothing like that has ever happened since the beginning of time. No one can receive their sight in that way. This must be just someone who looks like the blind man that we knew, but it can't really be him. And the blind man was there while they're saying that. He says, no, I am the man. I am the one. I know you. I know you. I know you. I remember these things that happened. I am the man who was healed. And the people were just astonished. They were amazed because, as I said before, nothing like this had ever happened since the beginning of time. Nobody ever heard of anything like this happening, that a person born blind had now received his sight and now he could see and recognize things. Well, the story just kind of spread like wildfire. Everybody in Jerusalem started hearing about this and talking about this, and people were amazed. But it didn't take long before the Pharisees found out about it and heard that Jesus had done this. And keep in mind that the power struggle between Jesus and the Pharisees. Before Jesus started his ministry, the Pharisees were the undisputed religious rulers in all things that had to do with the Bible and with worship and with the synagogue, which is where they worshiped. What they said went. What they would say would go because, they were the rulers. They had absolute control. And if you didn't do what they said, they would excommunicate you. They would kick you out of society. You'd have to go live somewhere apart from all the people you knew and loved. So they were very powerful. But when Jesus showed up, things started to flip. So, the script was flipped. Things started to change. In that, everybody was following Jesus and listening. The Bible says there were thousands of people. There were multitudes of people following Jesus wherever he went, witnessing the miracles, listening to his preaching, his teaching, his example. And, the Pharisees could see that they were losing control over what was happening with the Jewish people, and they weren't happy about it. And they were going to do whatever they could to try to regain that power and that control over the people. So when the Pharisees heard about the man being born blind, being healed, regaining his sight, they called this man. Called the council. There's 30 or more Pharisees sitting at these high tables. It's kind of like a courtroom-like setting. And they called the blind man in and they said, "Hey, are you the man that was blind or claimed that you were blind? If you were blind, how is it that you can see now?" And the man says, "Yeah, well, I was born blind. I've been blind my life. But the man Jesus came to me. He made some mud. He put it on my eyes. He told me to go wash my eyes in the pools of Siloam. And then I could see." Well, some of the Pharisees, the Bible says, believed that what he was saying was true. Others were very skeptical, and they tried to challenge what he was saying. They wanted to dispute what he was saying, and they were arguing with him. So they asked him this question. They said, "This man Jesus that healed you, who do you say that he is? Where do you think he comes from? Who is this person?" And the man who had been born blind said without hesitation, he said, "He is a prophet from God. He is a prophet from God." And they didn't like that very much. But they still weren't satisfied. They wanted more information to be able to dispute Jesus' authority. So what they did was they called his parents in, his mother and his father. And they brought them in before the council, so they're standing there with all the Pharisees looking on, from their high tables. And they said, "Are you the parents of this man who claims he was born blind?" "Yes, we're his parents." "Well, we have 3 questions for you. Number 1, we want to know, is this your son? Is this really your son? Number 2, was he really born blind? And number 3, if he was, how was he healed? How did this happen? How did this take place?" So his parents respond. They say, "Well, we know this is our son. There's no doubt. He is our son. There's no question about that. We know he's been blind from birth. He's never been able to see until today. There's no question that could take place. But how this happened, how he was healed, and who did it, we don't know. We don't know anything about that. He is of age. He's a man. Ask him." And the reason they said that was because a word had already gone out from the Pharisees to the society at large that if anyone acknowledged that Jesus was the Messiah or Jesus was the Christ, that they would be kicked out of the synagogue. They'd be blackballed. They'd be excommunicated. They basically would not be allowed to live or participate in Jewish society if they acknowledged that Jesus was the Christ. So that's why his parents said, "We don't know how he was healed. We don't know who did it. Ask him." So called the blind man in up a second time. So the parents leave, the blind man comes back, and they say, they basically kind of get in his face, and they say, "We know this man is a sinner. We know this Jesus is a sinner because you don't heal people on the Sabbath. This is the day of rest. We want you to tell us the truth. Tell us the truth. We know this man is a sinner." So what they're doing is they're trying to pressure him into saying that Jesus was a sinner. Because if he would have said that, then they immediately would have gone out among the people and just, said, "Oh, this man was healed, says Jesus is a sinner." And of course, that would have helped their cause in terms of this power struggle that they were experiencing. And the blind man answers them in this way. He says, "Well, I don't know if he's a sinner or if he's not a sinner, but what I do know is that I was blind and now I can see." And so the Pharisees, started saying, "Well, we don't understand how this could happen. You have to explain to us. This doesn't make sense to us. We want you to explain to us how you received your sight." And the blind man said, "I already told you. Why do you want me to tell it again? Do you want to become disciples of Jesus?" When he said that, they became angry. They didn't like him saying that. They were upset by that. And they were saying, "No, you are his disciple. We're disciples of Moses. We know Moses came from God. This Jesus guy, we don't know who he is or where he came from, we don't know anything about him." So then the blind man responds. He says, "Well, isn't that remarkable? He gave me my sight, something nobody's ever heard of happening since the beginning of the world. That's never happened before. And this man did that for me." We know that God doesn't talk to sinners. God doesn't help sinners. And if this man, Jesus, was a sinner like you say he was, there's no way he could have healed my sight. Well, when he said that, they really got angry because he was telling them that Jesus was from God and was the Son of God. And they took it that way. And so, they started yelling, "How dare you lecture us? You were born in sin. You were steeped in sin from birth. Get out!" And they kicked him out of the synagogue, and he was that this man was excommunicated from Jewish society. So now I want to pick up covered last week. And I'd like to read about a six-verse passage from John chapter 9. So what I'm going to be reading is the Gospel of John chapter 9, verses 35 through 41. And remember that the blind man has never seen Jesus, and Jesus made it so far. It says in the Bible, starting in John chapter 35, John chapter 9, 35. It says, Jesus heard that they had thrown him out. And when he found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" "Who is he, sir?" the man asked. "Tell me so that I may believe in him." Jesus said, "You have seen him. In fact, he is the one who is speaking with you." So he's telling him that he is Jesus. Then the man said, "Lord, I believe." And he worshiped him. Jesus said, "For judgment I have come into this world, so that the blind will see, and that those who see will become blind." Some Pharisees who were there with him heard him say this, and asked, "What? Are we blind too?" Jesus said, "If you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But now that you claim that you can see, your guilt remains." Now that you claim that you can see, your guilt remains. So Jesus didn't have a lot of patience with the Pharisees and pretty much told them the way things were. So let me just kind of summarize this, and then I want to break down some specific points that come from that passage and discuss that a little bit. So as we just read, Jesus goes out and finds the man who'd been cast out of the synagogue for his faith. And the man that had been kicked out, basically, as I said before, was excommunicated. He was in a position now where he was no longer going to be part of or be able to participate in Jewish society the way that he had done his entire life. It had to be very difficult, to be cast out of a society. And beyond his support for Jesus, this man also embarrassed the Pharisees by exposing their hypocrisy. And I'll talk about their hypocrisy here in a second. But I just want to say this first. The blind man knew very little about the man who'd healed him. He'd never heard of him before. He'd never spoken to him before. Didn't really know anything about him. But due to the fact that he was healed, he knew enough to recognize that Jesus was a messenger from God. And he told the Pharisees flatly that if Jesus was not God, he would never have been able to perform this miraculous healing. So I'm going to make reference to another passage in the Bible that talks about the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. Before I do, it's important that we understand the importance of sheep within biblical society, within Jewish and Hebrew society. So, from the very beginning of the Bible in the book of Genesis all the way through the last book of, the New Testament, which is, the book of Revelation, the concept of the sheep is something that's very, very important in many different respects, and I just want to detail that for a second before I launch into this other story about the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. So sheep were very, very important within Jewish society for a lot of different reasons. Number one was that, they harvested the wool from the sheep, which they wove into cloth, and they made their clothes. So they were dependent upon sheep for the very clothing that they wore on a daily basis. Although it might seem strange to us in our culture today, they actually milked the female sheep, the ewes. We typically think of cows, where our milk comes from. But in biblical times, they milked sheep, and they not only drank the milk, but they made cheese out of it more commonly, and it was an important part of their diet. The meat of sheep, specifically lambs, was very important. It's a very important food for them. And if you look at Jewish festivals, even in other Middle Eastern cultures, like the Muslims and stuff, every time they have a feast day where they're going to have a large meal, lamb is always, one of the main courses, because that's something that they have eaten and consumed there for, thousands of years in that part of the world. The other thing is, for sacrificial purposes. So when Jews would come to the temple in Jerusalem to perform the sacrifices for atonement of sin, they would typically bring a young lamb, and it had to be a perfect lamb. It couldn't be like a, deformed one or one that was sick or weak or something like that. It had to be the strongest, healthiest, best lamb that would be offered as a sacrifice, and the blood of that lamb was given as a sacrifice for atonement of their sins. And of course, we have carried that concept into Christianity, and we use that term to refer to Christ's sacrifice on the cross and him shedding his blood on the cross. And then the other thing was that the sheep was a symbol of wealth. So, the typical, family that lived in, biblical times, among the Jews, they might have 10, 12, 15 sheep, enough to satisfy their family needs, their daily needs. But really wealthy people would have hundreds or even thousands of sheep. So it was a status symbol. Like for us having a nice car, a nice house, or a big fat bank account. And for them, for the Jewish people during biblical times, it was sheep. If you had a lot of sheep, you were considered a very important person in society. So I say that because I'm going to segue into a story from, I believe it's Matthew chapter 7. Let me just verify. I'm sorry, it's Matthew chapter 12. And in this story, in this account in the Bible, Jesus is in the synagogue on a Sabbath day. And while he's there, there's quite a number of Pharisees present, and it's the day of worship. And Jesus sees a man there in the synagogue who has a withered hand. So this man has a hand that's shriveled up and deformed, and he can't open the fingers. And the Bible doesn't say whether he was born that way or it was caused by some kind of injury, but the fact remains that there was a man with a withered hand. And Jesus was preparing to heal him. He was going to perform a miracle there in the synagogue to heal this man's hand. But this was the Sabbath day. And if you go through the New Testament, you'll see, the Gospels, there were many occasions where Jesus healed people on the Sabbath. So the Pharisees didn't like that because they considered that work. They considered that something that was not allowed on a particular day. So one of them stood up and said, Rabbi, teacher, Rabbi, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? And Jesus didn't answer the question directly, but posed a question to them, as he did so often when he answered people who were challenging his authority. And here's what he said. Remember, we're talking about the importance of sheep. He said, which one of you here, he's pointing to all the Pharisees as he's speaking, he said, which one of you here, if he has a sheep, and that sheep wanders away and gets lost on the Sabbath, and falls into a pit and can't get out, which one of you here would not go over and find that sheep and take hold of it and pull it out of that hole, pull it out of that pit in the ground? And he sat there looking at him. Not one of them said a word, which was a tacit admission of the fact that they would have done that even though it was a Sabbath because they wouldn't want to lose a sheep. And Jesus basically said, you hypocrites. He said, how much more is the life of a man, of a human being, valued over a sheep? The life of a man is worth hundreds of times, thousands of times more than the life of a sheep. And yet you're not going to allow me to heal this man, but you yourselves have just admitted that you would go out and find your own sheep on the Sabbath and pull them out of that hole. So what Jesus was telling these people, the Pharisees at the particular time, was that they were all hypocrites. And of course, they didn't like that. But Jesus goes ahead and heals this man with a withered hand. And his hand becomes healed. He's able to use his fingers and his hand just like the other. It was a miracle that Jesus performed. And Jesus he made this statement, which is very important and which carries on throughout the rest of his career on earth before his crucifixion. And that was this. He said, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. It is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. And what he meant by that was he was reframing the definition of a miraculous healing from a work to an act of goodness and charity, an act of goodness, kindness, and charity. And that was kind of a significant quantum shift in the way people at that time were looking at that type of thing. So, let me pick up here. All right, I'm going to go on to my next topic here. So, in the passage we read in 35 through 41 from John chapter 9, Jesus asked the man who had been born blind if he believes in the Son of Man. He asked him the question, do you believe in the Son of Man? And the question that I'd like to look at is, what does that mean? What does that term, the Son of Man, mean? And it's apparently a pretty significant term because it's used 82 times in the New Testament. 82 times that phrase, the Son of Man, is used, and it's primarily used as the way in which Jesus refers to himself. So when Jesus talks about himself, he doesn't say me or I or use his name Jesus or even Christ or the Messiah. He refers to himself as the Son of Man. So it's obviously a very important term, and I'd like to take just a couple minutes to talk about what that means. So the complicated thing about that term is it actually has 4 separate definitions, but it means all of those at the same time, if you can grasp that. So it's not 4 separate things in different contexts. It's 4 different things simultaneously that the term Son of Man means. So the first thing it means is it's a title of humanity. It means that Jesus came in the flesh. And what we mean by that is this, that even though Jesus came from heaven as the Son of God, when he was here on earth, he was a human being just like we are. He got thirsty and he had to drink. He got hungry and he had to eat food. He got tired and he had to sleep. He experienced sadness. He experienced happiness. He experienced pain. He experienced temptation in the desert with the devil, and we can read about that at a later time. That all the things that we as humans use to identify ourselves as uniquely human, Jesus experienced all those things. So he was he was a human, and the Son of Man, in one respect, is a title of humanity. The other thing it's a title of humility, meaning that Jesus was humble. He was very humble. Think about it. He was born in a manger. What's a manger? It's a trough for animals to eat out of, cows, horses, sheep, whatever. So he was born in a manger, which is a very humble birth. Think about the way he was raised. His family wasn't wealthy. They didn't have a lot of money. They didn't have a lot of influence. His dad was a carpenter, which would have been a mundane profession. It wasn't one that you needed any type of particular education for. It was something that was passed from father to son. Jesus probably learned that as a young man. He probably worked as a carpenter, but it's a very humble profession. Jesus was also, despised and rejected by mankind. So as we all know as Christians who've studied the Bible before, Jesus wasn't welcomed with open arms. They didn't, we're so happy you're here. We're going to honor you and treat you like the king. He was despised and he was rejected and he was put to death as a criminal on the cross. So once again, just trying to make the point that it's a title of humility, and it contrasts with the term King of Heaven. Okay, so if someone came in and stood before us and started talking about the King of Heaven, we as Christians would all know that they're talking about Jesus. But when Jesus came to earth, did he talk about himself that way? I'm the King of Heaven? No. He referred to him as the Son of Man, which once again is a title of humility. But in addition to those two things, it's also a title of deity, a title of divineness, in that Jesus was divine. In the sense that Jesus was the supreme example of all that God intended mankind to be. He was the embodiment, of truth and love and eternal salvation. So it's a title of divineness, a title of deity, in terms of he's the embodiment of truth and of grace. And then the last thing, the fourth thing that Son of Man means, is that it's a fulfillment of prophecy. So there's a prophecy in the book of Daniel, chapter 7, where it talks about Jesus, where it talks about the coming of Jesus and some of the things that he'll do. And it refers to him as the Son of Man. So when Jesus chose to use that title to refer himself, he's referring directly back to this prophecy in the book of Daniel, chapter 7. So in order to better understand this Son of Man concept and what Jesus did when he came to earth in the form of a man, I'd like to kind of tell a story. It's called the illustration of the dog. And so I'd like you to imagine your dog, the dog you have at home. And if you don't have a dog right now, you've probably had a dog in the past. And if you've never had a dog, I'm sure you know someone who has had a dog and you've been around dogs. Dogs are pretty much ubiquitous in our society. So, we all have to understand, and we all know this, that, there's a great difference, there's a great gulf between human beings and dogs in terms of our abilities, just to mention a few things that we could. Dogs can't speak. Dogs are not able to engage in spoken communication. Dogs can't read, they can't write, they can't drive a car, they can't go to college and get an education, can't balance a checkbook, they can't, plan for the future. And, we can go on and on and on because there's such a huge difference between human beings and dogs. We could come up with more than 100 things, I'm sure. So intellectually, in terms of their abilities, their ability to process thought, their ability to do things, there's just a huge difference between us and them. And that's undeniable. So I'd like you to imagine that there's an issue with all dogs in the world, and they're in great distress. And this is something that threatens their very existence. That if this problem that dogs are having right now doesn't get resolved, doesn't get taken care of, all dogs are going to die, they're all going to be lost, they're all going to be gone. And the only way the dogs can be saved is if they can somehow, some way, become more human in the way they live their lives and the things they do. And that the only way that can happen is that if a human being decides to become a dog and go live among the dogs and teach the dogs what they need to do to become more human so that they can be saved, so that their existence won't be wiped off the face of the earth. Well, imagine if it was you that had to do that, right? What would you have to give up to leave your life that you have right now and become a dog? Well, spoken communication, right? You'd have to give up your friends. You'd have to give up your family. You'd have to give up your hobbies. You'd have to give up the organizations that you belong to. You'd have to give up all the things that you enjoy and like, including the food that you eat and the clothes that you wear. You'd have to renounce absolutely everything. And realistically, how many of us here would be willing to do that? Very few, I would guess. Very few people would be willing to give up everything they had to become a dog to help all the dogs in the world. But isn't that exactly what Jesus did for us? It is. He left the glory and splendor of heaven. There's things in heaven that I'm convinced are so beautiful, so fantastic, so wonderful, so brilliant, things that our brains cannot grasp. We don't have the IQ or the ability mentally to grasp and understand all the things that exist in heaven, which were a part of Jesus' daily life. But he gave all that up, and he came to earth in order to teach us what we needed to do to be saved. So I think there's kind of a parallel there. I think that story is a good comparison with what Jesus did. So back to the term Son of Man, just understand that by definition it means that Jesus came to earth in the flesh, in all humility, that he's the supreme example of all that God intended mankind to be, and he did so in fulfillment of the prophecy in Daniel chapter 7. So, all right, so let's move on to the next point. And back to John chapter 9, when Jesus is having this conversation in those verses that I read a few minutes ago. The man is asked by Jesus if he believes in the Son of Man. And the man who'd been born blind was initially unaware what that meant. He didn't know who the Son of Man is. So he replies to Jesus. He says, "Tell me who he is, sir, so that I can believe in him." And then Jesus reveals, "You have seen him, and the one speaking with you is he." So he's telling the blind man, "I am the Son of Man." And then the Bible tells us that the man who'd been born blind and been healed responds, "Lord, I believe." And then he begins worshiping Jesus at that point. And I tend to believe that he was saved. His soul was saved at that point because, remember, believing is part of that formula to be saved. Hearing, believing, repenting, confessing, being baptized, and then living a faithful life. The belief part is very important to that. And I'd like to read a quote from a famous Christian writer, a guy named C.H. Spurgeon. You may have never heard of him, but he does have a lot of literature out there in terms of Christian commentary and so forth. And here's what he said about belief. He said, quote, "I would recommend that you believe God up to the hilt, or else not to believe it at all. Believe this book of God," meaning the Bible. "Believe this book of God, every letter of it, or else reject it. There's no logical standing between the two. There's no logical standing place between the two. It is all or nothing." So what Spurgeon is saying is something that Jesus said many times throughout his ministry. You either believe in me wholeheartedly, completely, 100%, or not at all. It's all or nothing. And what Spurgeon, the writer, is saying here is there's no logical standing place between the two. Let me just talk about what he means by it for a minute. So on the one hand, you have a person who has committed themselves and turned their life over to Jesus Christ 110%. On the other hand, you have someone who doesn't believe and doesn't do anything or doesn't participate in any aspect of being a Christian or living a life as a Christian. There's no place between the two. Because if you were just to go halfway, let's say some of the things in your life, you're following Jesus' teaching and living as Christians, but other things you are knowingly not following Jesus' example, I guess I should say. You're living your lives in ways that are not Christ-like, that are not biblical. Are you going to be saved? No, you're not, because it's all or nothing. So when we say there's no logical place between the two, it means it's either everything or nothing at all. You can't be in between. You can't sit on the fence as a Christian. So there's an article that I read that has some kind of information that illustrates the point that I just make about the all or nothing thing. And in order to kind of make the point, I have to explain a couple things first. So let me try and do that. So I'd like to talk to you just for a minute about people that work in retail. And when I say people that work in retail, I'm talking about people who receive money from the public and give back change. So it would be somebody who's a cashier, or maybe somebody who's a teller in a bank. These are people that work in retail. And the thing about people that work in retail, something they learn very quickly, is that there's a lot of counterfeit money out there. There's a ton of the money that's floating around our circulation. You may have a bill in your wallet right now or your purse right now that's counterfeit because it's just everywhere, and there's a whole lot of it out there. Anybody here ever knowingly, or I shouldn't say knowingly, but anybody ever mistakenly receive a counterfeit bill as change or anything? Yeah, I have. Yeah, in fact, one time I went and got several $100 bills from my bank because I needed cash to pay some bills, and I go to pay the bill, and the guy's like, "This is not real. We can't accept this. This is fake." I just got it from the bank. We better take it right back. And the bank was real gracious, and they, exchanged it and gave me like real ones. But as a result of the fact that there's so much counterfeit money out there, the industry has developed ways to determine whether a bill is fake or not. And one is those pens. You guys have probably seen those pens they have. And what they're those. If you have a larger bill, like maybe a 20, 50, 100 for sure, they'll mark it. And if it's a good bill, the marking will be clear or it'll be brown. But if it's black, then they know it's a fake bill. Well, the problem comes about is sometimes those pens are not available. They run out of ink, or they lose them, or they just don't have one at the time. So they have to have other ways to determine whether or not a bill is legitimate or not, whether a note of currency is actually a real bill. So one of the ways they can do that is by taking the bill and holding it up to the light. Because think about it, if you have a counterfeit bill and a real bill and you hold them side by side, the ones they're making nowadays, you can't tell the difference. They're the same width, the same length, same feel, same colors, same pictures, same serial numbers. They look identical. But one of the ways, there's other ways that the Secret Service won't tell us about, but the way that I know that you can tell is you take the bill and you hold it up to a bright light, and if you do, it becomes translucent, and you can see a hologram picture of the president that's on the center of the bill to the right-hand side. But only if you hold it in a bright light. If you put it down on the table and try to look at it, you can't see it. But that's one way you can determine whether a bill is authentic or not. So put that thought in the back of your mind for a minute, and I'm going to talk about something else real briefly. I'm going to talk about churchgoers. And I'm not talking about anybody here. I'm not talking about anybody in our congregation. I'm talking about churchgoers in general in the United States, which is millions of people, most of whom we do not know. But if you look at churchgoers, there are a lot of people out there that to the untrained eye look like Christians. Okay? So they come to church every Sunday like Christians. They dress like Christians. They sit in the pews and they sing like Christians. They pray like Christians. They say amen at the end of the sermon or end of the prayer like Christians. And for all intents and purposes, they act like Christians, right? But how can we really tell if they are or not? How can we really, can we look at a person just based on their appearance and know whether or not that person has turned their life over to Christ 110%? That they're truly living their life as Christ wants them to, or at least making the effort to do so? We can't. We can't do that just by looking at people. So the way that you can tell whether or not a person is a Christian is the same way that you tell whether or not a bill is legitimate, as we hold it up to the light. But in this case, it's the light of Jesus Christ. Because if we hold a person up to the light of Jesus Christ, then they will reflect God in their daily life. The things they do, the things they say, the things that they're involved in, the things they believe in, the things that they avoid, they will reflect God if you hold them up to the light of Christ. Now, back to the concept of all or nothing. It's an unfortunate truth that most people, past, present, and future, that have lived on this earth and are living right now, will not go to heaven. They will not be entering. The majority of people will not be entering the kingdom of heaven. And how can I say that? Well, it's not me saying it. And actually, Chris Roberts said this in his sermon last Sunday from Matthew chapter 7. And Chris talked about this, and I think it's good. I'm glad he said this, because I think it's an important thing for us to keep in mind as often as we can as a Christian. And in Matthew chapter 7, verse 13, it says, "For wide is the gate, and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But narrow is the path, and narrow is the gate that leads to life, and very few will find it." So what does that mean? It means that most people will not go to heaven. And the only way that we're going to be able to go into heaven, if we want to be sure of that, it goes back to the concept of all or nothing. We have to turn ourselves completely over to Christ, 100%, and let Him take control of who we are and our destiny as Christians. All right, I have one more point, and I'm going to try to squeeze it in the next 5 or 6 minutes. So I might be talking kind of fast here. So what we have from this passage is basically it's a new understanding of blindness in terms of spiritual blindness. You know, the story moves beyond physical blindness to symbolize a deeper spiritual blindness that can only be overcome by believing in Jesus as the true light. And the Pharisees are spiritually blind simply because they refuse to see the truth about Jesus despite the evidence that's right in front of them. You know, they're so convinced of their own spiritual might, or their own spiritual insight, that they can't acknowledge their own sinfulness, nor can they acknowledge Jesus' divine authority. So I came across a story that I think makes a really, really good comparison between the physical world we live in and the spiritual world in terms of that spiritual blindness concept. So I'm going to try to cover that in the next few remaining minutes we have before we dismiss. So I don't know if all you are probably old enough to remember a pretty famous rock group from back in the late 60s, early 70s called Simon and Garfunkel. And I'm intimately familiar with Simon and Garfunkel because I can remember as a little kid back in the late 60s and early 70s, my parents listened to their music. And the reason I listened to it is because it was clean. You know, it wasn't associated with, you know, illicit drug use or the hippie movement or counterculture or anything. It was just like good, clean folk music. Well, there's a story that sheds some light on this particular topic involving one of the members of that musical duo named Art Garfunkel. And back in the early 60s, Art Garfunkel went away to Cornell University in New York City to study law. He initially wanted to become an attorney. And when he went there, he met a guy that became his lifelong best friend. He met a guy named Sandy Greenberg. And Garfunkel and Sandy found they had so much in common that they became immediate best friends. I mean, they liked the same kind of music, same type of literature, you know, they liked the same kind of food, you know, same sports teams, and everything. I mean, they're just like best friends for life, two peas in a pod. And they got along so well that they both, you know, became roommates, and they rented an apartment together, and they were actually living together. So things seem to be going well. You know, they're both enrolled in the same, you know, prestigious university, Cornell. They're studying law. They're going to classes every day. But one day, Sandy realizes that his eyes are really bothering him. It's like his eyes are hurting, and you know, he feels like he got an infection or something. He can't see well. It hurts him when he tries to read. So he goes to the doctor. He just goes to like a general practitioner. And the doctor checks him out, looks at him, and comes back and says, oh, you know what? You know, you have a case of conjunctivitis. And if you don't know, conjunctivitis is pink eye. And that's what's causing this infection in your eye. You know, I'm going to give you some eye drops. You know, take these for a couple weeks, and you should be fine. So Sandy goes home. He starts taking these eye drops. 1 week, 2 weeks, another week goes by, and it's just getting worse and worse and worse. And his eyes are hurting him really bad now. And he's getting to the point where he's having difficulty like reading a book or seeing, you know, recognizing people's faces. Everything's getting like blurry and hazy and everything, and he's really concerned about this. So he goes to a specialist. He goes to a medical doctor who's a specialist, an optometrist, and puts him through a battery of tests. He's there for several hours. At the end of it, the doctor comes and meets him in the you know, patient waiting room, and he says, you know, Mr. Greenberg, got some bad news for you. You have glaucoma, and you have a very advanced case, and you've had it for a while, and you just didn't know it. And it's to the point where the optic nerves in your eyes are damaged, and it's never going to get better. You know, you're always going to be sight impaired. I'm just telling you the way it is. So Sandy's absolutely devastated by this news. You know, he's overwhelmed. He starts falling into despair. He becomes depressed. He feels like he just can't function in his life anymore, knowing he's going to be a blind man for the rest of his life. And it just keeps getting worse to the point where all he can see now is blackness. Everything is black. He can't see any light or anything at all. So as a result of this depression and this crushing news that he received, he withdraws from school. Goes back home to Buffalo, New York, which is where he's from. His parents weren't very prosperous. You know, they really struggled financially to be able to put him in school. It appears he can't even, you know, finish his education, and he's just given up on everything. You know, people try to call him, he won't return calls. People try to write him letters, he won't return the letters. He just wants no contact, he wants to isolate himself, really just wants to die. Well, his best friend, his best buddy, Garfunkel, realizes this is going on and knows he has to help him. I got to do something to help Sandy. I got to do something to pull him out of this. So he takes a train, goes to Buffalo, New York, meets Sandy at his house, and he says, Sandy, look, he says, you can't give up. You got to come back to school. You can't just give up on life. You have so much potential. I care about you. I love you. I want to do whatever I can. Sandy's like, my life's over. There's nothing you can do. Don't talk to me anymore. Just leave me alone. I don't want anybody coming here and talking to me and trying to tell me anything. There's nothing I can do. My life is over. I quit. And Garfunkel's not willing to accept that. And Garfunkel tells me, he says, you can't quit. I'm not going to let you quit. We're going to find a way. You're going to come back to school and you're going to graduate from college. I'm going to make sure that happens. And I'll tell you what, if you're willing to come back to school, I will be your eyes. I will do everything for you. I'll make sure you get to class. I'll help you study. I'll take you to the grocery store to buy your stuff. I'll take you to the laundry to wash your clothes. I'll do everything. That I will be your eyes and I will help you. Just come back to school. You got to do it. So Sandy's a little bit skeptical. He's like, all right, well, I don't think it's going to work, but I'll give it a try. So they go back to school. Sandy starts taking classes again, and he realizes that he can do this now. He starts having a better attitude. And like Garfunkel said, he helps him study, helps him get to class every day, takes him where he needs to go, grocery store, laundromat, wherever he needs to go, Garfunkel is his eyes. But within a couple of months, Garfunkel starts realizing, he goes, you know what? Not sure if this is a good thing that I did, because now he's completely dependent on me. He doesn't trust anybody else. He won't do anything. He won't go anywhere unless I'm there helping him. And he can't go through his whole life like that. Something has to change. So Garfunkel comes up with an idea to change the situation. Here's what he does. He takes Sandy to Grand Central Station, the subway station in New York. Anybody ever been there? It's like 10,000 people all crammed like sardines in this huge room. They're trying to find their subway trains to do all these different boroughs in New York City. It's just a chaotic mess. So he takes them there. And they're walking in the middle of the crowd. They've got people all around them. They're packed in there. And then Garfunkel says, oh, you know what, Sandy? I forgot to turn in an assignment. I got to go turn that assignment in right now or I'm going to get an F in that class. I'll see you later. I got to go. Bye. And he leaves. So now Sandy Greenberg, the blind man who can't see anything, is in the middle of this crowd, completely blind, has to find his way to subway train 47 and has no possible idea how to do that. And he said it was the worst experience of his life. It was the most horrible thing he ever experienced. People are pushing him, they're shoving him, they're knocking from side to side. He's asking people for help, nobody will help him. Like, hey, I got to find train 47. Occasionally someone will say, go straight ahead, go make a right, make a left, but nobody will stop and help him. So he puts his hands out trying to grope his way, and he unintentionally grabs some woman's breast. And this woman screams and yells at him and gives him a tongue lash and cusses at him. He's embarrassed. I'm sorry, I can't see. So he's continuing trying to walk, continuing trying to ask people where to go. And he comes up on a stairway and he falls down the stairs and he gets this gash in his shin where he cuts his leg. Gets up, dusts himself off, still asking for people, nobody help him. He's stumbling around, trying to find his way, comes to a second stairway, falls down again, gets a big gash on his forehead from falling down on the pavement. A couple more hours go by with him begging people for help, just crying out for someone to help him find the train. And eventually, 2 hours later, he gets on the subway train and is able to get back home. So he gets back home, has the key, opens his door to his apartment, walks in and hears Garfunkel's voice. Says, hey, Sandy, how you doing? How'd things go? And Sandy's response was, how could you do that to me? How could you leave me all alone in that situation where I was completely helpless? I got hurt. I got embarrassed. I was desperate. It was the worst thing that I could have. If you were truly my friend, you never would have done that to me. And Garfunkel replies, I was there. I was there every step of the way. I saw you getting pushed and shoved. I saw you grab the woman's breast. I saw you fall down the stairs once, but not twice. I saw you begging people for help. I saw you when you got on the subway train. I was on that train with you, as a matter of fact. I was there with you the whole time. And right then, the light went off in his brain. The spark clicked, and he realized, wow, this guy just gave me the greatest gift anyone could ever give me. He taught me that I can be independent. I don't have to be dependent on other people. And from that point forward, Sandy, even though he was completely blind, he did everything on his own. Went to class, learned Braille so he could study on his own, did really well in his classes, was able to do everything that he needed to do, went on to graduate from college, became a successful attorney, got married, has a family, and he's now still living, a very successful man. So why do I tell that story? Isn't that exactly what Jesus does for us? In a certain respect, right? Jesus never told us that our life was going to be easy. He never says that. He says you're going to have trials. You're going to have difficulties. You're going to have hardships. You're going to be persecuted. Your life is going to be hard. But one thing he does say is, I will never leave you. And the Bible says, I will never leave you or abandon you. I will always be with you, even until the end of the age, meaning forever. And that's the end of my lesson. I've gone over. I appreciate